Welcome to Ransomware Exploded, Modern Defenses Against a Technological Plague. I'm Chester Wisniewski, Principal Research Scientist at Sophos, and my goal is to share with you some of the latest information that we've seen in Sophos Labs related to ransomware and how the criminals are using tactics to compromise their victims. I'm hoping that we can also then inform you of ways you may be able to better defend yourself against these threats. So we'll start out by talking about who's really targeted and how they're acquiring their targets. We'll go through some of the most frequently exploited products and services that they're using to gain a foothold inside of your networks. We'll also look at a bit of how they abuse trust that you may have in vendors and other parts of your supply chain that may give them a foothold to gain access to your network through legitimate access. There's a lot of abuse of legitimate tools, so we'll talk about what those tools are and a little bit of the behavior of what it looks like when those tools are being abused. And of course, impairing your recovery. They want to make sure that you're in a particularly difficult bind if they manage to get into your network to make it that much more difficult to recover from these attacks. And we'll take a glimpse at what that looks like, as well as how they identify the valuable things that they want to steal and ultimately how they're locking it up. It may seem obvious, but there are some nuances to that can help defenders spot malicious activity. Of course, to wrap things up, we're going to want to talk about modern defenses and how to monitor and master those basics and what specific things are most important to look for amongst those basics, how you get a baseline for what things should look like, best ways to deploy multi-factor if you're unable or unwilling to necessarily deploy it across your entire estate, where it's most effective, and strategies you can use to only impose the tax, if you will, when necessary, and when to update, when to mitigate, and how to segment the network better, and ultimately how to go into threat hunting mode so you can find attackers if they manage to make it past your best defenses. So, how are they getting into the network ultimately? Like, how are they gaining access? What is the way that you're most likely to succumb to attacks by these types of criminals? And the truth is, the criminals themselves that are conducting ransom attacks in most cases are not actually the ones breaking into your network to begin with. They're typically buying you from what is now being called an initial access broker. Back in the day, if you've been doing this for a while, you may have heard of people having loaders, this kind of thing, where in essence they're infecting your machine with a small piece of malware that allows them to have a foothold inside of that computer and then can later on bring down additional payloads, which means they can sell you off, if you will, to other criminals. And on the left side of your screen, you can see there that emails are a very popular way of doing this. And what's interesting is, in addition to just sending you directly the attachments like you see in the Word screenshot there in the middle, what way they're using now is to evade anti-spam technologies and to evade sandboxing technologies and other things that will automatically investigate or explode a payload or an attachment that could allow it to be detected by the good guys. They're often luring people into making phone calls and other things. These are two examples from North America, but we have seen these globally. The top one is about a subscription that you've signed up for a video service. And if you want to cancel that, you don't want your credit card to be charged, you should call this phone number to let them know. The second one I actually received in my own inbox in a honeypot I run at home. That claims to be from Amazon Web Services and that I'm going to be charged $120 a month if I don't cancel my subscription. And if I would like to cancel it, I conveniently can call this phone number. Now, that phone number +1 206 is the United States of America, 206 is Seattle. So even for people in America that might be somewhat familiar and go, oh, Amazon, right, they're in Seattle. That makes sense that I could call this phone number in Seattle in order to cancel this subscription service. That seems pretty innocuous because, of course, there's nothing here to block. There's no link to a website. There's no attachment. But when I, in fact, call that number, I get someone on the phone in a call center. And that person in the call center explains to me that, oh, if I'd like to unsubscribe to this service, actually what I need to do is type in this website into my web browser. So Of course, that's the way that they're going to lure you to the malicious document. And then once I get there, I download a Word document like you see pictured, and they go, oh, right, so you're going to have to enable the macros, because when you fill out the form to cancel the service, it needs to send us the message back over the internet. And that's what the macro does, right? It allows us to see that you filled out the form correctly, and in fact, you want to cancel your service. And when in reality, of course, you're inviting a Trojan horse onto your computer. Now, that computer, if it's an individual's computer, may just have information stolen from it, or it may be used to later on send spam, things like that. But in the context of ransomware, if it happens to be your corporate computer, they now know that that's a computer that is a member of a domain, and they can usually discern by the name of that domain or the internet domain that that computer is connected from, that that is in fact a business computer, which they may be able to sell up to other criminals. Much of remote access can be abused that way as well. We see credential stuffing against RDP, VNC, TeamViewer, LogMeIn, all these different types of remote access services. And you can see on the right side of your screen, that's actually an underground forum on the dark web known as UAS Shop. And that's some of the victim computers listed there that I can choose to buy from the criminals and remotely access them for very small sums of money. You can see less than $20 US is sort of the going rate. And they tell you how much bandwidth, what the operating system is, how much memory it has, that kind of thing. Of course, if you buy access to these computers, you then can find out the full name of the computer, the full IP address. Then you may be able to target specific organizations that have had computers compromised that are being sold through these forums. Other things they're doing is exploiting weaknesses and flaws that have been unpatched. And unfortunately, this is incredibly common. The most frequently things we see being exploited have been remote access technologies, followed by email services. So going all the way back to January of 2020, we're coming, a year and 3 quarters ago now. We're still seeing heavy abuse of Citrix vulnerabilities. One of them was well known as called the Shitrix vulnerability. In Citrix remote access systems, there are still lots of unpatched systems out there, unfortunately, that can be exploited using that. Other common ones are against VPN solutions like Pulse Secure and FortiVPN. And unfortunately for Fortinet, also FortiGate firewalls have been pretty heavily exploited using some of these, just scanning the internet with Census.io style or Shodan style services, looking for unpatched firewalls and VPNs as a way to gain access to networks. That's particularly dangerous because VPN servers are almost always a member of Active Directory, because you want remote access users to not have to have a unique password. Of course, you want to share authentication with your enterprise, but that means if the criminals gain root access to those VPN concentrators, they often can dump the entire Active Directory as a domain admin and gain access to all of your credentials within your organization. We're still seeing Exchange being abused by all kinds of different groups, not just ransomware. We do see crypto miners and other things targeting Exchange servers, but there were several serious Exchange vulnerabilities, one around February of 2021 and another major one in August of 2021. And both of those are still under heavy exploitation for organizations that haven't yet been able to patch against those. In fact, most of the victims we see when we see Exchange as the entry into their network, multiple different criminals have been there. We'll often see there was a crypto miner, and then later on they were ransomed by a different group. Abusing trust is big. I'm not going to go through this in too much detail, but this is a kind of a diagram of how the Kaseya attack. Kaseya, of course, is a remote access solution, and they offer a cloud product and they offer an on-premise product. It's often used by managed security service providers or managed service providers to remotely access their customers' networks in order to provide services to them. And this was a vulnerability in the web server that was part of the on-premises version of the Kaseya remote access offering. Almost always this would be outwardly facing so that that service provider can access the web portal to log into their customer's network in order to manage their computers on their behalf. And unfortunately, it had an unauthenticated upload vulnerability that allowed SQL injection. And through that, they were able to instruct the remote access agents on all the computers within the victims to retrieve a specialized digital certificate that was actually the malicious payload wrapped up in a certificate, which meant when it came through firewalls or scanners, it just looked like any other encrypted blob that was a digital certificate, something perfectly legitimate, which the malware then used PowerShell to unpack. And when it unpacked it with the CertUtil built into Windows, it extracted the certificate into two different files. And the two files that were inside of that certificate were a vulnerable version of Microsoft Defender, signed by Microsoft, another legitimate piece of code, that could be exploited to do what's called a sideload attack and sort of inject malicious code into that legitimate Windows Defender process, resulting in the ransomware in the end. And this is a really complex attack chain, and it shows why basic things like traditional old-fashioned antivirus is often ineffective at blocking these more sophisticated attacks. The truth is the legitimate files, all of the executables that were run were legitimate executables that were signed by Microsoft. We saw certutil, PowerShell, Microsoft Defender. These are all legitimate programs signed by Microsoft that were all part of this attack chain. So looking at the behavior and the entire 40,000 foot view of the attack surface is really important for modern defense technologies to be effective against these styles of ransomware attacks. Once they're inside the network and they've got a foothold, they're starting to use your tools against you. And some of these are more legitimate than others, but all of them by no means are considered malicious files or malware. Angry IP Scanner will often be used to scan your network, or if not that, maybe things like Nmap, or even other freely available software like Nessus can be used to scan your network to identify all of the assets that they may want to steal data from and or encrypt. Mimikatz by Gentle Kiwi is a well-known red teamer tool, frequently used in these attacks against to steal credentials or elevate privilege. If there's an ability to run this, even if you're a lower privileged user, you may be able to run this tool to grab password hashes from memory that belong to administrators and allow yourself to become a domain administrator. Microsoft tools that are frequently used by legitimate admins are also in part of these attack chains. PowerShell and Windows sysinternals tools, things like psexec, pskill, Process Explorer, etc. And in the end, another tool that's open source, often used for backups, called rclone, is used to exfiltrate stolen data. This complicates things, right? Because your antivirus vendor and your security vendor is unlikely to automatically consider PowerShell activity being malicious or Windows sysinternals tools. So you need to be able to monitor and manage these legitimate tools and see when they're used behaviorally in an attack chain that is different than the expected or normal use that you would see your administrators use to manage your network. And that takes us to the next step. Now that they've got a foothold and they've been able to explore your network using your tools, now it's time to steal your information and send it off to the crooks so that they can later extort you. Not all groups do this. This technique started around 2 years ago, maybe a little longer, where the Maze group started specifically stealing data before they encrypted it. Almost all ransom groups do this now. The number of groups and the names change on a weekly basis. As I'm recording this, the Revil group was apparently taken down perhaps by the US government and some other countries cooperating to disable their networks, but they'll soon be back with another name, or another group will simply replace their malicious activity because there's too much money on the line to stop. And once they're in, they'll start scouring your network, specifically looking for information from your finance, human resources, IT departments. They'll look for file names that have words like budget or passwords, because many organizations, unfortunately, are still putting lots of shared passwords into spreadsheets or sending them around through unencrypted emails. They're looking for things that they can use to extort you, legal documents in particular. Maybe you have contracts or settlements with competitors or employees over certain legal issues, and if they were to release those publicly, it'd be very embarrassing to your organization. So that's the kind of thing they're looking for, and in order to find that, they'll simply look at Active Directory to find all the file servers within your network where they need to go looking. Once they find what they're looking for, they'll use that rclone open source tool to synchronize all of the good stolen documents up to some sort of a file sharing service in the cloud. They'll want to use legitimate ones that'll blend in with your normal traffic. Most often we see them abusing a service called Mega. Mega.io used to be called mega.co.nz. It's operated by a man named Kim.com, who's a convicted criminal, but kind of proudly calls his file sharing service a privacy company. He had been accused of facilitating software piracy. It's kind of a good place for dogs with fleas to go lie. But we don't just see abuse of Mega. We do see abuse of other file sharing services like Google Drive, Dropbox, Box.com, and others. Anywhere they can set up a free account to store the stolen files or use a stolen credit card to establish an account will blend in with a lot of legitimate traffic within most organizations as they steal that sensitive data. Now that they've got the stolen data, it's kind of the last before final step, the penultimate step, if you will, to sabotage you. They're trying to set you up for failure, if you will. They know that the first thing you're going to do is want to restore your backups, and that your administrators are going to need access to the network. They'll try to pick times of day in particular where they think things may be monitored less frequently, so that gives them a bit of an advantage to give them time while they're monkeying around where they may not be noticed as they're starting to trigger the early steps of encryption, etc. So they'll start scouring the network to determine how are you doing your backups. Are your backups online or are your backups offline? Now, if your backups are offline, you're safe. I mean, largely. If they're on hard disks or tapes that are removed from tape loaders, that means that they're offline, and unless the criminal breaks into your office, it's almost impossible for them to delete them or destroy them. But most organizations, unfortunately, are using cloud-based backup services and or lots of hard disks and arrays where they may just be backing them up to live hard drives that are connected to SANs or other type of shared disk storage within the network. So when that's the case, things like Veeam, Carbonite will often be cloud services to manage your backups that may store them on services like Backblaze or Amazon S3 or other similar type of file storage backends in the cloud. And for convenience, many administrators will have linked those backup services to their Active Directory. And that means if the criminal already has acquired administrative access on your network, they can simply log into those backup services with those same stolen credentials to delete the backups. And tying all these services into Active Directory is sort of part of the problem here. I mean, it's certainly convenient to have single sign-on, but if that single sign-on is not protected by multi-factor authentication, then that means one password stolen can delete everything, including your backups in the cloud. And this is one of the steps we'll see right before they're ready to start triggering the actual ransom attack, is to go in and delete every backup they can find. And then once they've deleted the backups, go into Active Directory, disable all the admin accounts to slow down the response when you finally notice that you've been victimized, and use that as a way to continue to negotiate. I don't actually have it in my slides, but I guess it's a good time to mention, because they have compromised your network, when they get to this stage where they're disabling admin accounts, if you are able to recover some of it, remember the criminals are in control of your network at this point. You can't trust your communication. If you start communicating with one another about how you're going to kick the criminals out of your network, or how you're going to engage with law enforcement or outside counsel or services to help you recover, if you do that via email, they're reading your email, right? They've got access to Active Directory. They've got access to your entire enterprise at that point. So be sure to be able to communicate out of band using WhatsApp or Signal or some other service where it's not tied into the same credential system that's now compromised and owned by your adversary. Of course, lastly, the thing that they're looking to do is encrypt and extort. And I use that image there of a calendar to remind you that more often than not, they know what time zone you're in, they know what country you're in, and they will pick a time where they feel they've got the most amount of time to trigger the exploitation. Encryption takes a long time. Many of you, if you've worked in IT, understand if you deploy full disk encryption to a laptop computer, it may take an hour or 2 hours to complete sometimes. And so the criminals have to get really clever about how they go about their encryption, and they do a few things to accelerate this process to cause more pain to the victims. Firstly, they try to pick a holiday often, or at least a weekend. So many of these attacks we see triggered on Friday afternoons, with the expectation that staff have gone home or will be going home for the weekend and will not maybe be monitoring systems as carefully and closely as they are during normal business hours at your organization. If they can pick a holiday like Christmas or any bank holiday within your country, that gives them another advantage to maybe have an extra day before they get noticed, which allows them to spend more time stealing documents, spend more time encrypting more systems, or disabling more processes and defenses. So those are important things to remember. On the right side of your screen, they're starting to also deploy more speedy encryption algorithms that aren't even all that widely adopted amongst the good guys or the people doing cryptography for legitimate purposes. Clearly, the best, most secure, tried and tested way of encrypting things is to use the RSA algorithm to negotiate an AES key the same way we do all of the encryption, most of the encryption on the internet, the same way we encrypt websites, the same way we encrypt disks on our computers. That's kind of tried and true, but it is a little slow. RSA is a slow algorithm to asynchronously negotiate a synchronous key, and even the synchronous encryption that's accelerated in AES by technologies built into our Intel and AMD CPUs and modern computers uses a bit of processing power. And when you're talking about potentially encrypting gigabytes, if not terabytes worth of data, it can take a long time, which means you may detect something's wrong and be able to stop them before they can complete their attack. So they're really looking at ways to accelerate it. Two of the most common ways is they first started adapting a new encryption algorithm known as SALSA 20. I say new. In crypto world, new means 15 years old. These things have to be tested for a long time to be sure they're safe before we use them. I think SALSA is around 15 years plus old. Both SALSA and Cha-Cha were invented by a guy named Daniel Bernstein. He's a well-respected cryptographer, and these are designed to be lightweight, very fast encryption algorithms. You'll most likely see them in use on your mobile phone. We often use them for mobile encryption for accessing websites so that we don't use up all the battery on your iPhone or your Android device when you're surfing encrypted content. The criminals have started adopting, in particular, Cha-Cha 20, the most sophisticated, fastest of these algorithms to do encryption so they can do it much more speedily than they can do it with RSA and AES. Of course, they need to deploy the encryption software to all of the victim computers, and the two most common ways I've observed them doing this is either using a group policy object on Active Directory to instruct all of the member computers that they target to install the software, just as if you were telling them to install legitimate software. They instruct them, of course, to install the encryption software, which is a pretty bad idea for the victim, or PowerShell scripts. They'll use PowerShell to push many of these things in combination with things, as I talked about earlier, like Microsoft SysInternals tools. Perhaps they'll push a PowerShell to all the computers in the domain, and then they'll use PSExec to instruct those remote computers to run that script, which pulls down the encryption software, the ransomware, encrypts all the files, and of course plants the ransom node. And in some cases, they're even auctioning off the stolen data to the highest bidder as another pressure tactic in order to get victims to pay. But at this point, to be honest, the victim is in so much pain, I'm not sure the extortion techniques are necessary. Your network is disabled. You're likely unable to conduct business at this point. And if your backups were online and they were able to disable your administrative accounts, I don't know that additional pressure is necessary, although some of these crews do seem to try to apply it. So this is an example attack that we helped a victim partially defend themselves against. Unfortunately, we were unable to necessarily stop the criminal from gaining initial access to the victim's network, but they were able to have some success, and it's a good example of how these things unfold. So Conti is one of the largest ransom groups in the world, arguably. I certainly amongst the people that we help that are victimized that come to us to assist them, more of them have been victimized by Conti than any other ransomware group. They're the most prolific of the last year or two, without question. And they're still operating. As I record this, they actually posted a note today attacking security researchers and defending Revil, the group that was theoretically taken down by Western law enforcement. But when they attack a victim, they're really efficient and smart. They've got a script that they follow. One of their affiliates that works within the Conti group actually leaked sort of the manual. Like, it's an instruction manual of how they teach people to attack victims and the steps that they go through to compromise them. And I got a copy of all these manuals in Russian that were stolen, and it's quite interesting to just see it is a bit formulaic. They have a protocol they follow. In this case, they gained their initial foothold through an unpatched Fortinet firewall, and once they were able to gain access, they were able to get onto 2 domain controllers right off the bat. Because again, once they got onto that firewall, they were able to get administrative credentials they could extract out of the firewall and then use that to log in as domain admin. Within about 16 minutes, they got onto 2 different domain controllers within the network. At that point, they started to deploy Cobalt Strike, which is a penetration testing tool. It's a commercial piece of software used by red teams and penetration testers in order to test your network security. Of course, the criminals steal this software. They use pirated versions. And they started deploying Cobalt Strike, which was just the clue that was necessary for the victim to start getting some alerts in their security console. So the victim, of course, realizes right away Cobalt Strike is a bad thing if they're not conducting a penetration test right now. Immediately contacted us for help, and they were detected and booted off of one of the servers that they compromised. Unfortunately, the customer in this case didn't realize they had gotten onto 2 different domain controllers. When they got the Cobalt Strike detection, they very much focused on, we use the term eviction the same way you might evict somebody who doesn't pay their rent. We want to evict the criminals from the network. We want to evict them from your servers. So they were able to evict them from one server, but unfortunately they didn't realize they were on the second server. So in only 15 minutes, the criminals, once they realized they booted off the first one, they connected to the second one and they continued to perform their attack. And at this point, they started specifically scanning the network for documents in the human resources, IT, and finance departments. And we're looking for things like budget files. And as alluded to earlier, used our clone to steal anything that looked like any type of that data and upload it to the mega file sharing service. And for our lucky sake, they use scripts in order to copy all these files, and the password for their mega account is included in those scripts. So that was kind of handy. It allowed us to find out what files they had stolen and actually delete them from the cloud service once we were able to remove them from the network. So that was kind of handy. They were also looking for password lists and any kind of spreadsheets. Spreadsheets typically contain financial data that may be very useful for their extortion techniques. They managed to copy the ransomware using some scripts to around 300 different computers across the network. And that was around the time that our rapid response team was able to engage with the client and start locking down the methods the criminals were using to access the computers. So fortunately, in the end, CryptoGuard and some other technologies this customer had deployed were able to slow the criminals down and allow us to help that customer close the holes, patch that Fortinet firewall, and some other things to lock them out of the network. But this is really a great example of the type of process we see. Gain initial access, use red team tools and legitimate tools to move around the network, find files you want to steal, copy them off to a drive in the cloud somewhere where you can access them later, then start to mass deploy the ransomware. And were they successful, of course, they would have triggered the ransomware. In this particular case, we were fortunate enough to be able to stop them before it got to that point. Another group that I mentioned earlier that we think may be gone now, but is a very interesting group because a lot of these groups almost kind of have a reputation, or they almost advertise themselves. And we refer to them as Revil, and Revil acknowledges that they were named for the Resident Evil movie. And they do not like being called Revil. They like being called R-Evil. So we call them Revil because it irritates them, and I quite like that. They had brand changes in the past, so we may see them surface again. In the past, they were called GanCrab, and they're kind of famous for running their leaks blog, which is when they steal data from your organization, they leak it on the dark web on a blog called the Happy Blog. Now, it is never a happy day to be on the Happy Blog, because that means you've been compromised and your information is being leaked. But rather than leak the data publicly right off the bat, they actually steal the data and offer it up for auction. And so they try to auction off your sensitive information in case some criminal is willing to pay them for it. And in the end, if you don't pay the ransom and no other criminal pays to buy the stolen sensitive information from your organization, in the end, they will publish your information on the Happy Blog. As of time of recording, the Happy Blog has been offline for 2 days. So we hope to not see it reemerge, but REvil has disappeared twice in the past, and then a few months later reemerged. So it's hard to know for sure whether they're truly gone forever or whether we have a temporary victory against them. And these guys, so fascinating stuff. If you really are interested in this topic, I encourage you to go to YouTube and search for Elite Russian Hackers REvil. And you'll see the YouTube video on the left side of the slide there, where there's an actual interview with the guy whose name is unknown. So he's not unknown to us, but his name is unknown. And he granted an interview talking about how they choose victims and how they go about attacking people and why they think it's okay, sort of their moral views of the world and how they think these attacks are justified. And right after that interview, they posted a sort of $1 million bounty in cryptocurrency to one of the underground crime forums, promoting themselves and asking for penetration testers to sign up to work for them to attack more victims. And if you signed up as a penetration tester and were accepted into their affiliate network, they would give you a portion of that $1 million as a signing bonus for agreeing to work with them to recruit more victims. And they, Unknown did a more recent interview with a blog called The Record. And Dmitry Smilanets did a interview with them in Russian and translated it to English. You can find that on the Record's website. And again, interesting to talk about how he was a poor kid growing up in Soviet Union and Russia and nothing to his name and was picking through trash heaps looking for partially smoked cigarettes. And now he's a millionaire. And how awesome and successful it is to be a ransomware criminal. So there's a lot of braggadocio that goes on in the ransom community. So this is sort of their downfall. The Record again broke the news. The Record.media is the blog I was referencing a second ago on a criminal forum. The co-partner, a guy named One Day with an underscore between 0 and N, was the co-founder of REvil with Unknown. And he posted to a forum that some fishy things were going on with access to their server. The server had gone offline. Unknown had disappeared. And now somebody seemed to be tampering or accessing the website, and so he was going to go dark. He was afraid maybe it was the police, and he was probably right. So I hope he didn't get away, but nonetheless, he kind of suspected that people were after him and said, for now, we're off. We're getting out of here, leaving town. They made tens of millions of dollars. If they are able to get away, they're certainly not hurting for cash to aid them in their escape. But generally, the police don't usually shut things down until they feel they have their victim in a place where they may be able to apprehend them. So hopefully we'll hear in the not too distant future about some indictments from the U.S. Department of Justice or others. On the right side, you see sort of a retaliatory this morning. Conti, who I mentioned earlier, sort of wrote a big screed on their dark website talking about how REvil had honestly earned their money and how evil the great devil United States is, and was even poking fun at people like me, calling us social media hobos, and how we all really deserve it and there's nothing wrong with what they're doing because we're just thieves on the other side harming people, and stealing back from us is a perfectly legitimate thing apparently. So there's certainly developments in the ransomware space, the cat and mouse between attackers and defenders, and even amongst ransomware crews themselves, self-referentially talking to one another, that it's very difficult sometimes to keep up with this. But don't forget in the end what their goal is. Their goal is simply to victimize people who've left a security hole open, steal all of your money, and leave your business worse off in the end, despite having done nothing to them. So that's enough about the attackers. Let's look into, as defenders, what are the hallmarks or things that people that are successful at defending themselves are more likely to have in place, or practices that they're more likely to follow that lead them to be safer than others. Certainly, patching is a big part of that. And I'm going to talk about patching a little bit more in a slide and a few more slides. But I mean, we all know we need to patch. The problem is the ubiquity of it, right? And as we see with the stormtroopers, the Lego stormtroopers there, we really need everything to be the same in order to be able to be effective at this. We can't patch 9 of our Exchange server, but not the 10th one. Or we can't patch all of our endpoints, but not our servers. And unfortunately, the ubiquity of the basics is more challenging than it sounds. We're seeing more and more organizations where they have fantastic security tools deployed. They have a reasonably well-trained SOC or Security Operations Center monitoring their behavior. They're certainly trying to make good balanced risk decisions around how to deploy those tools. But in the end, the lack of ubiquity means that once the criminal is on the network, they become admin and unravel all the rest of it. And so look at your security tools that you may run on your endpoint, whether it's something from our organization or one of our competitors, or even the built-in Windows Defender. Once you become administrator on the domain, you likely have the ability to disable all of that protection. So if you've got a server that's unpatched and all the other ones are patched, once I gain access to the one that's unpatched and I gain administrative access on it, I simply turn off the protection on all the other ones. All of that patching is undone. It's no longer helpful. We're frequently seeing organizations applying strict security policies to endpoint computers and no security or limited security to server computers, sometimes for performance reasons. It's not always clear why those policies are different. Too many exclusions. We see, I'm going to exclude the C:\Windows folder to speed up my servers. Except, of course, the criminals hide everything in C Windows temp, and that means all the malware goes undetected. So there's those gaps are where they're gaining their advantage, and we have to eliminate the gaps. And we're not able always to patch everything, and I'll talk about mitigation when I talk about patching some more. But that ubiquity of security policy, ubiquity of security tools being in place on all machines that hold sensitive data that can be used in these attacks, and also managing carefully how we grant exceptions to policy. You may have a policy that everything needs to be patched in 14 days, but the Oracle server, we're going to wait 45 days. That starts to increase your risk quite dramatically. And unfortunately, lots of times a temporary exception is granted to a policy while you're determining a better way to secure that system, and that temporary thing is there forever, which means it's not temporary. So in essence, the compromise in your policy leads to compromised computers at the end, because those things are never changed. And there's been a few victims I've talked to in the recent months where they temporarily had disabled some piece of their security software on some servers because it was interfering with something. They were working with their vendors. Things were patched, and then they never turned those things back on again. And years later, they had exceptions from 6 years previous that were still in place because they didn't review the exceptions. So if you're going to make exceptions to policy, which is unfortunately part of doing business, we have to make exceptions sometimes. Those exceptions need to be reviewed on a regular basis and reverted back to the standard as soon as possible, because any of those gaps allow the criminals to gain a foothold within the network. Knowing what's normal, clearly pencils that bend in a circle aren't normal. And clearly, you don't expect to see a poppy in a field full of ragweed. So what is normal? And unfortunately, if you're not patrolling, no different than a police person might patrol a perimeter of a network. If you're reactive, right? So on the left, we've got the reactive person. They're defensive. They're looking for something that went wrong and then responding to the thing that went wrong when it comes to them. They're sort of like sitting in the SOC and waiting for a user to open a ticket. The user opens a ticket, my laptop's infected. I go out, I re-image the laptop. That's a pretty normal process. If you're reactive like that and you're not going out and looking for problems, you need to be patrolling the perimeter like the police on the horses here in the slide. You need to be out there so that you know what normal is. You ride around the park twice a day on the horse. You know what normal activity is. These kids play with the Frisbee in the afternoon. These people go golfing every day at 3 on Fridays. They golf at 3 o'clock and we see them every week. When there's something unusual, you'll know that this seems like it's not right. But the only way to tell what's normal is to establish that baseline. And there are many ways of doing this. I mean, some people establish baselines by monitoring their network traffic through their firewalls, and then they might spot that large upload of the stolen data when they see suddenly a burst at an unusual time for gigabytes or terabytes being transferred on the network. It might be just taking alerts seriously, looking at what a normal load of different types of alerts is and noticing that there's a particular spike in a type of thing happening. But the key here is it's moving from reactive to proactive. You don't really know what normal is when you're only responding to things as they're coming at you. When you have the freedom to actually start patrolling is when you start to get more of a sense of the neighborhood. What does my network look like on different days of the week, different hours of the day, different months of the year? And is that expected or unexpected, so that I know whether it's something I should spend extra time and money investigating? And too often we hear about a terabyte being stolen and the victim had no idea. The criminals have been in their network for weeks, sometimes months, and they didn't have any idea. But there were little telltale signs all over, but nobody really picked up on it because they weren't looking for them. So in order to look for them, you have to know what's normal and what's not. Remote access must use multi-factor. It is not okay under any circumstance to allow a password to log in. And I don't care what the technology is. And it's unsafe at this point. It doesn't matter if it's SSH, if it's Telnet, if it's RDP, if it's your remote access solution like Kaseya or Baumgarten or other large-scale remote access solutions. It doesn't matter if it's your VPN. Anything that allows, if you have a perimeter-based defense, I should say, if you're not already fully zero trust, anything that allows somebody to simply know a secret and gain access to all of your network is not okay. Now, most of us probably aren't using RSA tokens like in the photograph there anymore. I happen to have one, so I use it as an example. I use the thing behind it, a YubiKey, personally, to multi-factor remote access all of the systems I'm responsible for managing. It's a smart card that I can use to authenticate with both a physical thing plus a PIN in order to gain access. Within our organization, we use a software push notification service as another kind of two-factor. Really, but on remote access systems is not negotiable. You may decide you don't want multi-factor for email, or you might not want multi-factor for getting access to your wiki. Each organization has to measure risk for themselves to decide where and how to apply the strongest security protections, depending on what they can afford or what inconvenience they're willing to tolerate. But you cannot grant entry from the outside internet anymore simply using a password. They're being stolen from your web browser. They're being stolen from your desktop computer. They've been stolen from LinkedIn. They've been stolen everywhere. People do reuse them. They use predictable ones, and they're constantly being stolen from staff members. And there's just no reasonable way to expect people to keep passwords safe across an entire organization and always use unique ones, no matter what you do to try to help them. You should try to help them. People should use unique passwords, but it's not going to happen. And multi-factor will stop almost all of these attacks in their tracks without with even a poor password. So it really is not optional. It is essential. And you got to decide that balance between updating and mitigating. And I got to thinking about this going, this is not a new idea. We've been talking about this forever. So I went and looked through some slides, and I found a slide deck I had from 2011 when I was doing a series called Anatomy of an Attack, where I was talking about how the amount of time you have to patch is vanishing. Because, of course, back in 2003, when the blaster worm was running rampant across the internet, it was 72 days from the disclosure of the vulnerability until the worm was released. So you had 2.5 months to patch. And yet people still didn't, right? Like we saw this worm just race across the internet. Because back in 2003, it wasn't that common to patch as quickly. And then, accelerating closer to the time of that presentation, the Aurora attack, which was the attack that China allegedly broke into Google in China. China, the country, broke into Google China through an IE6 zero-day vulnerability. And of course, as soon as that was discovered, it was exploited everywhere on the internet with no time to patch. So already we had been down to 0 reasonable days to patch for most vulnerabilities in 2010, which quickly was followed up by the Stuxnet attack against the Iranian nuclear centrifuges. So more than 10 years ago, we were already at a point where we couldn't wait, and yet we're waiting. And we understand why. I mean, Microsoft doesn't always ship perfect patches. We've seen some blue screens and other things happen from Microsoft patches in recent months. Oracle systems, and I'm not picking specifically on Oracle, but I will because they have lots of vulnerabilities. They had 461, I think, this month. So that's more than a few vulnerabilities per quarter to have in your products. But they're big, complicated enterprise tools that you can't afford downtime. Patching them is a risky thing if you build a lot of custom logic around them. So it's understandable that we can't always patch on day zero. So what is your mitigation plan? Like, you need to mitigate those vulnerabilities. You can't just go, well, we're going to wait 60 days to patch our Oracle servers and then do nothing. You have to do something during those 60 days while you're doing the testing. You need to have either software defenses in place that are looking for exploitation, things that might detect buffer overflow attacks, things that might detect SQL injection, depending on what the service is. You may want to have advanced vulnerability detection software installed on those servers. You also may want to shut certain ports off or put them behind proxies. Things like a WAF, a web application firewall, may be another way to put a mitigation in front of a slightly vulnerable service. But again, don't perpetually have an exception to applying that patch. We're going to do it in 60 days. During the 60-day window, we're going to be behind a WAF proxy. We're going to have advanced endpoint detection software on that server in case there's a buffer overflow or other type of attack against those known vulnerabilities. And we're going to get that patch delivered by the 60th day, whether that means working with the vendor to assist you with the testing, whatever it takes. Making sure you're going back and around that loop around the mitigation of, protecting the best you can, trying to detect if it's failed, responding to it with mitigations when you can, fixing the system, and then identifying the risks again. And you got to keep going around the loop if you can't patch immediately. And so what we see many organizations doing, of course, is generally applying patches to endpoints nearly immediately when they're available from Microsoft and other vendors. And on the servers, we see more of a 7 to 14 day time window typically. But when it goes longer than 7 or 14 days and when those mitigations aren't in place, you're almost guaranteed that that server is going to be hacked. So would you rather have the risk of a blue screen which reboots the server, or a guarantee that it's going to be compromised and potentially turn into a thing like a ransomware attack? I know I'll take a blue screen any day. Raising barriers is really important, and we've gotten bad at this. Back when I mentioned Blaster a few minutes ago, on a flat network architecture, Blaster would hit your entire network. And so in 2003, 2004, 2005, this was happening a lot. And so one of the things that we did as vendors was finally get everyone to start segmenting their networks. If you could put up some firewalls, segment your network, you would have much less likelihood that a criminal would be able to get into one system and compromise all the systems. Unfortunately, in most of these ransom attacks we see today, they're running rampant across the entire network. And most famously, we said NotPetya attack, which was against a Ukrainian accounting firm, actually affected a lot of firms outside of the UK because they may have had a Ukrainian subsidiary, and then it spread across their entire internal network, even though no one else used the affected software in that Ukraine required. We saw this with Maersk Shipping when they were ransomed. Their entire global network went down. In fact, the only thing that saved them was they had an internet connection down somewhere in Africa, and that meant they had one domain controller that was not compromised because they were offline. And they literally had to physically FedEx the hard disks from that server back to their corporate headquarters in order to recover their system. So they were very fortunate that one system was offline. So there's a lot of advantages to segmentation. And if you can segment finance from the rest of your network or engineering from the rest of the network, you need to decide where your high and low risk areas of your network are. But if you can put up some firewalls between those areas, they're not just useful for blocking lateral movement, which they certainly are. I mean, it's a great way to slow down an attacker from compromising all the assets within your organization. They're also a checkpoint. I'll use this image of Checkpoint Charlie in Berlin. They're a place where you can record and log the movement of data, and that's equally as important. If you happen to be compromised and your regulator or your attorneys say, were they able to access the files in human resources? Well, if you don't have a firewall between human resources and the rest of the network, you likely don't know if they were moving data in and out of that network. But if you do, you at least know the data was stolen. Even if the data was allowed, and unfortunately it was stolen, you now have a record that there was a connection from server A to server B, and this amount of data was transferred. And that allows you to start to track down what parts of your network were compromised as part of the attack. And it also allows you to sort of seal the hatches, no different than you might do in a ship. If one part of a ship starts to flood, you close the doors and you lock them down so only one segment of the ship floods and the whole ship doesn't flood. And even if the firewall networks are open for normal operation, as soon as you detect that you're under attack, you can immediately close them all. And at least now you've been able to isolate the attackers into one segment of your network. And lastly, you have to be threat hunting. Back from that, get away from reactive and get into proactive. You need to be out there actively watching. And in a recent survey we did of victims that had the beginnings of a ransomware attack that was able to penetrate their network, 47% were able to effectively defend themselves and not end up being ransomed. So they got infected. The criminals may have even encrypted a server or two. They may have started, stealing data. But before they were able to infect and encrypt all the systems, they were able to detect that in a victim from their networks. That's less than half, though. We need to do better than that. More than half of us need to be prepared and actively watching for these attacks. And in interviewing victims, those that said that their practice was to have threat hunters and people that patrolled the network, watched the logs in the SOC, maintained what a normal looked like, and understood that these administrative tools are used on Saturdays for maintenance, not on Mondays, and knew when they saw it on a Monday, it was a criminal on the network, whereas when they saw it on a Saturday, it was probably legitimate maintenance activity. Those are the ones that survive these attacks. They're the ones that don't pay the ransom. They're the ones that stop it before it gets to the point where it encrypts their files. And more often than not, they're the ones to detect it within the first 24 or 48 hours of it starting, which is often enough to prevent all damage. Many of these attacks take 7 or more days from start to finish. So if you can detect them in an hour or 4 hours, or God forbid, even 24 hours, you're far ahead of the pack. You're okay. There are humans that are attacking it. These are not bots. This is not an automated process. It takes the criminals some time to identify the data they want to steal, the data they want to lock up, how they're going to turn off your backups. All those things take human beings that are unfamiliar with your network a bit of time, and they make a bit of noise along the way, right? And so you can detect that noise, but when you detect it, don't just acknowledge the alert. Investigate it. And that's the difference between threat hunting and being reactive. A threat hunter is patrolling the perimeter, watching for the things that's out of place, listening for the broken glass in the front window, and going and investigating it. And if you hear it and you investigate it, you're likely to survive these attacks with far less cost to your organization, if not making it through it without even losing any data. And that's really the goal. And that's what we're hoping, that you're able to learn some processes and techniques for accomplishing that for your organization based on what I was able to share with you today. So I thank you very much for listening to my session. I hope you found it educational and helpful. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can find me on Twitter at Chet Wisniewski, Wisniewski. And if you'll search for me on Google, it's easy to find my email address, and feel free to contact me at Sophos. We're always happy to share what we know and do our best to help protect you against the latest threats. Thank you.